show. We have a very special guest for you this time. Mr. Richard N. Gottfried, Assembly Member Richard N. Gottfried, more popularly known as Dick. Dick Gottfried, that is. Dick Gottfried has been in office since 1970. That alone would land him on TV. But he's also been married to the same woman since 1971. And he is, I think, in my opinion, the best straight friend the LGBT community ever had. He has introduced a ton of bills that have helped us. He did it before it was fashionable. I mean, you know, he is truly totally straight. So, I mean, this is like because he thinks he should. I know, what can I say, you know? So, I mean, it's very nice of him to care about us, and he cares about a lot of other causes. And he is going to tell us, well, all about Dick. Gottfried, that is. You know, he's going to tell us how a man like Dick Gottfried becomes a man like Dick Gottfried. So here we go, the one, the only, the special, and the truly unique, Mr. Dick Gottfried. Hello, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Now, your name is Richard, but they call you Dick.
Some do.
Like your wife?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. What does that mean? Anyway, now, I'm just going to shoot out questions because I want to get it all in this one interview. Where were you born?
I was born in Chelsea in Manhattan, although my parents lived in New Jersey at the time. A little odd, but they lived at one end of the Lincoln Tunnel. I was born in French Hospital, long since closed, at the other end of the Lincoln Tunnel.
Your mother was with you, I hope.
Yes, as far as I know. I have no memory of that occasion.
Well, okay, now, where did you grow up?
I spent most of the first 18 years of my life, we lived in Flushing, Queens.
Do you have any siblings?
I have an older sister.
Were you always political?
Only since about the age of 12. When I was 12, 13 years old, John Kennedy was running for president. And I, like a lot of people, was just totally captivated with him and decided that public service, running for, hopefully serving in elective office, was what I wanted to do. Good. And kind of got totally addicted to it.
Wonderful. When you see me looking this way, I'm checking the time and I'm checking the monitor and everything. This is not Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer circa 1960. This is a little studio.
But you don't have to check the time. We have someone doing that.
Yes, yes, yes. But being the obsessive-compulsive that I am, I like to double-check. Okay. Now, what is it about JFK that captured your imagination?
I think he showed that people in politics, you could be in politics and be smart and be focused on the public interest, be progressive, and accomplish things and make things happen. And from about that age, I decided that that was what I wanted to do, that the idea that I could think things and they could become law was just an utterly captivating idea.
Now, most of us were exceedingly upset, obviously, the day poor JFK was assassinated. It must have been especially upsetting for you.
It was, and for most people I knew, it was a devastating time. People were concerned, what does this mean for our country? For me, it was, in retrospect, many people who didn't particularly care for Kennedy at the time, once he was assassinated, looked back at him and his presidency and, saw redeeming qualities that they never knew were there while he was president. People tend to forget that while he was president, he was, much as Obama has gone into some difficult times, Kennedy was very controversial and disliked by many people while he was president. For me, I never stopped thinking he walked on water. So it was for me just a very devastating feeling for the future of the country.
Now, when you got into high school, you decided to be political.
Right. When I arrived in high school, I fell in with a couple of other kids who were also turned on to politics and public service by Kennedy, and we decided we would sort of band together, and among other things, we took over student government in the school.
Excuse me, when you say you took over it via elections.
Through elections, yes. We did not stage a coup. They don't allow that in high school.
I know.
But soon after we left high school and went on to college, we started getting involved in local politics on the West Side. One of that little gang of troublemakers is now my Congressman Jerry Nadler.
Oh, wonderful.
So Jerry and I go back to the fall of 1961.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. How cool is that? Okay, so now you decided to run for office. You were exceedingly young when you ran in 1970. What gave you the audacity of hope to think that someone that young could run and win? And, well, why don't you answer that question?
Well, I guess when you're, I mean, I started, when I declared my candidacy, I was 22. I was 23 when I was elected. Part of it is when you're that age and you come up with a cockamamie scheme, you don't recognize that it's a cockamamie scheme. And we meaning our little band, had already been very active in the West Side community. By the time I was running for the Assembly, I had organized several block associations and community projects. I had been one of the major organizers of the anti-war movement on the West Side of Manhattan. There were many people involved in that movement, but I was one of them. A couple of years before, we had been among the people who were running the McCarthy presidential campaign on the West Side.
Eugene McCarthy, as opposed to Joseph McCarthy. Yes.
Right, who only you and I remember. Not me.
Yeah,
Right.
well, I don't think even his descendants remember him, Joe.
Right. But as a result of all of those efforts, when I ran for the Assembly, I was running with the active support of, I don't know, probably 100 or so volunteers who were out ringing doorbells for me. And so even though I was 23 years old and in the middle of law school,
at Columbia,
at Columbia, I had a very extensive record in the community to point to.
Now, of course, being a baby boomer and this being 1970 in New York, I would imagine 1962 when you thought of running for, 1969 rather, when you thought of running. Well, our lovely technician is coughing and sneezing, so never mind. Now, what was New York like in 1969?
Well, there was, I think, a lot more political activism than there is today.
I agree 1,000%.
With the civil rights movement and the beginnings of the women's movement, the very early beginnings of the gay rights movement, the anti-war movement had captivated an enormous segment of the population.
Certainly our whole generation.
And brought people into political activism. And so there were new neighborhood political organizations sprouting up all around the city, and the West Side of Manhattan was one of them. I think it was a very exciting, certainly a very exciting time. I think it was a good time for progressive politics, although Richard Nixon had just been elected president. But certainly in New York City, it was a time of a lot of ferment and forward movement on progressive politics. I don't think we've seen quite that level of activism, particularly among young people, since then. I think that's a shame. And
it was almost actually a badge of generational belonging to be involved in politics in those days. The technician coughed, I coughed, we all coughed.
For many people it was, yeah.
Now, you went to Columbia in a time of the Columbia riots, among other things.
Right. Actually, the big Columbia riots happened
68.
in the spring of '68. I entered the law school in the fall of '68.
Oh, so you just missed it.
I missed that excitement. And then in the spring of '70, when there was more campus turmoil, I had actually taken that semester as a leave of absence to run in what at that time was a June Democratic primary for the Assembly.
Now,
So I missed the May 1970 campus disruptions,
that
the whole Kent
craziness,
State
which
business.
sparked everyone.
Right.
Well, a tinderbox,
Right.
as I remember. Excuse me. Okay, everybody's coughing, you know. So now,
Not me. I chair the health committee in the Assembly.
well,
so-
there you
so
go.
I'm
See?
not allowed to cough.
No, I mean, it's not in his contract. What can I say?
Right.
So now you were elected. It must have been very unusual for you to be so very young in a group of quite mature, at least physically, if not emotionally or politically, men. And do they sort of treat you like, hey, kid, get out of my way, don't bother me, huh? You hippie?
Well, I don't think anyone ever mistook me for a hippie. I was a nerd from the day I was born. I mean, in my junior high school yearbook, there's one kid who's wearing a tie in all the pictures. It's me.
Oh, well, there you go.
So I was,
At least it wasn't your sister.
right. So I was never a hippie, but I think many of my colleagues were somewhat bemused by me. I remember the opening day of the assembly session, because I looked like I was 12 at the time. The sergeant at arms stopped me at the door and said I would have to wait for my father to come,
Oh,
because he
my
thought
God.
my father was Assemblyman Gottfried, not me. And I had to explain that actually my father was at work and he was not going to be there that day. But actually, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle, from the start, I think I developed a very good relationship with a lot of my colleagues. And
Did they mentor you? Anyone?
there were people who helped me figure out what was going on and move things along. You know, one in particular in local West Side politics at the time, sort of the division was written up as being between the kids, namely us,
Right.
and
Exactly.
what we
The
refer
so-called generation gap.
yes, and the people who we referred to as the adults. One of the adults, then Assemblyman Albert Blumenthal from the district just north of me, was somebody who at the time I was running, we were sort of at loggerheads with. Once I got elected and got to know Al better, I very quickly came to understand that he was a superb public servant. And to this day, I would say he is certainly one of the finest public servants I've ever known.
That's a lovely thing
He
to say.
unfortunately died very young. But Al and I got to be close allies, and I learned a lot from him.
Now, let's go ahead to the 80s. Suddenly it is the 80s, and the gay people want their rights. Now, you are indisputably heterosexual. Everybody knows this. What gave you the courage to back gay rights when it was considered by some a disgrace, when people might have said, oh, well, he must be gay or he wouldn't care about this? What gave you the courage to do this?
You know, I don't know that it was anything particularly courageous. I mean, a few months after I first arrived in Albany was the first press conference around the introduction in 1971 of the gay rights bill, which then took another 32 years to become enacted.
By Passanante, I believe, wasn't it?
I believe Bill Passanante was the original introducer. I was at that first press conference. It didn't strike me as being a particularly striking or courageous or out of the ordinary thing to do. But remember, I was 23 years old. What
And
did
a
I know?
baby boomer, so much more comfortable with
And you know, when you come from the west side of Manhattan, a lot of things strike you as perfectly normal and ordinary, and not particularly striking that in other parts of the world would be looked upon as
illegal.
Well, or a courageous stand to take. It didn't particularly occur to me that it was a particularly courageous stand to take. LGBT issues have just always seemed to me like racial equality and gender equality, just sort of a basic given that how could you know, what would there be an argument about? Obviously, a lot of other people don't see it that way. It just never struck me as being something that needed to be proven or argued about.
Now, why don't you tell us some of the, or actually all of the LGBT rights bills that you have sponsored and or pushed through?
Well, as I said, I was one of initially a handful, but then a larger number of sponsors of the bill to add sexual orientation to the state human rights law, going back to '71. In the early '80s, when the HIV epidemic arose, even before I chaired the health committee, I was involved in the original legislation. I wasn't the lead sponsor of it, but was involved in the original legislation to develop state funding for HIV services, to create the AIDS Institute within the health department, which was quite a landmark step. In my first few months as chair of the health committee, I took on the issue of protecting both the voluntariness and the confidentiality of HIV testing, and of HIV records, which was I think certainly at that time a complex but very important piece of legislation, and very crucial to giving people the confidence to come forward and be tested and seek treatment, et cetera.
And also, of course, in those days, no one knew how it was contracted, so everyone was terrified.
Yeah. I was the original sponsor in the Assembly with Tom Duane in the State Senate of the marriage bill in '03.
You've certainly done the trans community a lot of good turns.
Yeah, the gender bill, which would add gender identity or expression to the human rights law, was also, I've been the lead sponsor of that, and that was first put in, I guess, around '02 or '03. The marriage bill, of course, is now carried by one of the LGBT members of the Assembly, Danny O'Donnell.
Yes.
My name is now the second on the bill. We've passed it in the Assembly 2 or 3 times now, I guess, and I'm hoping the time will come fairly soon. It'll pass the Senate.
Okay, now, what exactly, I'm looking at the time. I think we have about 10 minutes. Now, what would you say is I told you these would be non sequiturs, is the key to career longevity?
Oh, I don't know.
Especially for politicians.
Yeah, well, one thing is that in order to keep getting reelected, you need to want to do that. I have always found the state legislature to be an enormously productive and gratifying place to pursue advancing the public interest. Now,
so what you would say,
most people who read the New York Times or any other newspaper, and from what they read about the New York legislature, people ask me, "What are you, crazy? It must be horrible being up there in Albany." And what I say to people is that if my workplace bore any relationship whatsoever to what you read about in the New York newspapers, I would have gone off to, I don't know, practice law or teach or do something 35 years ago. Fortunately for me, as someone who lives and breathes trying to have an impact on public policy and to advance a progressive agenda, Albany is actually a place where you can really do that.
So basically what you're saying is give the public what they need and they will keep reelecting you.
Well, at least if you have the good sense to be running for re-election in Chelsea and Hell's Kitchen and some of the Upper West Side, being a dyed-in-the-wool progressive gets you reelected. There are a lot of places on earth where that gets you,
assassinated,
tarred and
yes.
feathered and driven out of town.
Yes. So now, if you weren't, you mentioned teaching or law. What if you were not a politician? What would you be doing?
I'm really not sure. I think I would probably be doing something in the nonprofit public sector, public service world, possibly teaching, possibly working as a lawyer either in the nonprofit world or in the public sector.
So you would be a civil liberties lawyer, perhaps?
I might be. I've been a card-carrying member of the New York Civil Liberties Union since I was in college.
Good for you. Okay, now, you have a lot of interests. Like, for example, you are interested in Asian culture.
Yes.
Which is unusual for someone not Asian.
A little unusual. I mean, for the last, dozen years or so, what I do every Saturday morning is go over to the east side of Manhattan to a place called the China Institute and spend several hours doing Chinese calligraphy.
Speaking of Chinese calligraphy, who is your favorite philosopher?
My favorite philosopher is Confucius.
And why is that?
Why is that? Many people would say, why would a progressive, the common Western perception of Confucius is that he is the philosopher behind the very rigid authoritarian structure of much of Chinese politics for the last 2,000 years. Fortunately, there is a progressive interpretation of Confucius.
Which is?
Like most religions and philosophies, it can be interpreted in many ways. The progressive interpretation of Confucius is that we have a profound social responsibility to one another, and that our government has a profound social responsibility to all of the people. And I mean, one of the ancient Confucian statements of values is that all under heaven is for the people.
What exactly does that mean in about one sentence? It's where our time is.
It means that the world does not exist to serve the emperor in Chinese tradition. The emperor exists to serve the people.
Wonderful. And perfectly true, and certainly the cornerstone of democracy.
Yes. And that philosophy, like every philosophy, has had people who pervert it.
Of course. And many different interpretations.
But I believe Confucius would have been horrified to see his philosophy and his writings used for 2,000 years to support a very authoritarian and repressive regime.
Often fascism. And okay, now, if you had something to say to aspiring, let's say some 12, 13-year-old kid is watching this at home, and she or he says, I really admire Dick Gottfried and I want to be like that, but how can I? I mean, how do you get from sitting at home watching TV to being Dick Gottfried? What would you say?
I would say get involved, stay involved, focus on, if you're committed to the public interest, make that your work. And running for the legislature or any other public office is one way to advance a progressive agenda
in other words,
public service.
Start locally.
Yes, get involved in your community, get involved in local political activity, stick to your principles, and stick to it.
How practical is it to stick to one's principles? And we have next to no time, when, of course, expediency rules politics and every other business.
Oh, people often use that as an excuse.
Excuse me, isn't politics the art of compromise?
Yes, but what that ought to mean is never missing an opportunity to advance your agenda, even if it's one step at a time. Not selling out your agenda, but advancing it as much as you can at any given moment. You've got to believe in your agenda and believe that if you stick to it, you can keep moving forward. And as I say, it doesn't have to be by running for office. There are a zillion ways to advance the public interest.
Such as?
Such as working in the nonprofit world, such as working, teaching, advocacy, a whole host of ways to do it. I think we need a new generation of young people who understand that running for office and serving in office is in fact one way to advance a public interest agenda.
I totally agree. And I hope that at some point the same political fervor and fever of the 1960s comes back to the world and young people feel what our generation felt. You know?
Yeah, and if you allow yourself to believe what you read in the papers that no good can come from political activity, you will be essentially unilaterally disarming yourself.
Exactly.
And that is an enormous mistake.
You're shooting yourself in the foot before you start.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so now, by the way, do you believe in the ultimate perfectibility of humankind?
Oh, I don't know.
Nice political answer.
I'll settle for believing that we can always keep moving things ahead.
Good. And that would mean, I hope, fairness and rights for all and all sorts of nice stuff.
The progressive agenda covers that and a long list of other things.
Okay. I hope you never retire. I think you might agree with that.
Well, I sometimes feel I have retired. This is what I'm doing for my retirement.
Someone once said that when you go to work, it should be so much fun you don't even realize it's work. Would you say that's your deal?
Well, I think the saying is if you find a job you love, you'll never have to work a day in your life. And I often do feel that I have been blessed enormously by very early on finding work that I love and having the extraordinarily wonderful opportunity to keep doing it and to be representing people who like my crazy ideas.
Good for you, and we love your crazy ideas, and we sincerely hope you keep throwing those crazy ideas at us. Okay, my guest has been the one, the only, the unique, and I do mean unique, Dick Gottfried. He really, really cares about what's going on, and he really does stuff to make it better. And I am a dyed-in-the-wool Dick Gottfried fan, as many of you are, and we love Dick, and Dick Gottfried, that is. And on this show, you have to clarify that, you know. But anyway, yes. Which is not to say I don't love Dick, but anyway, I love Dick Gottfried. And
we love you too.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I hope you nice folks out there love me. Anyway, my guest has been the one, the only, the magnificent Dick Gottfried. Vote for him whenever he runs, every time he runs, because he's great and he'll do you a lot of favors and help you a lot. He will, you do. Anyway, I'm Diana Montford, and I love you people, and I want you to be happy, and I want everything to go well for you and all that lovely stuff. And I love you, and I will see you next time. Love you. Bye. Oh, let me hit the credit button. Please, where the credits go on. Did they go on? Yes, thank God they went on. Good, the credits. The Diana Montford Show. Okay, love you. See you next time. Bye.